Welcome back. On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy Roy, and my colleagues at Teamwork Arts and JLF Toronto, I welcome you to this session of JLF Toronto Virtual Festival. Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge. Richard Ovenden and Vickery Bowles in conversation with Sharmila Sen. In Burning the Books, Richard, the chief librarian of the Bodleian in Oxford, charts 3,000 years of neglect and literary vandalism in libraries across the world and the consequences for human culture and the sum of human knowledge. Beginning with the Library of King Ashurbanipal of the Assyrian Empire, he journeys us through continents and centuries as he tells us of the history of books and ideas and the libraries that house them. Vickery, City librarian at the Toronto Public Library, speaks of what needs to be done in terms of public policy and funding to nurture and sustain the library system. In conversation with author and editorial director of the Harvard University Press, Sharmila Sen, they explore the inner life of the libraries. A little bit more on our speakers. Richard has been Bodleian's librarian, the senior executive position of the Bodleian Libraries, University of Oxford. He is a fellow of the Society Antiquaries, the Royal Society of Arts, and a member of the American Philosophical Society. He was made OBE in the Queen's Birthday Honors in 2019. His books are John Thompson, 1837 to 1921, Photographer, and A Radical's Books. Vickery is city librarian at the Toronto Public Library, serving 2.9 million residents through its 100 branches and online network. She believes in the difference public libraries make in the lives of individuals, in communities and cities, and is working to advance TPL's new strategic plan, focusing on new service models, digital literacy and inclusion, workforce development, and innovation. In conversation with Sharmila Sen. Sharmila is the author of the award-winning memoir, Manifesto, Not Quite, Not White, and the editorial director of Harvard University Press. We're delighted to have Launchura as the podcast partner for this session. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A, so please feel free to send in your questions by typing in the question box on your screens. All our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Do follow our pages at JLF LitFest across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to be notified of the upcoming sessions. Stay tuned to the jlflitfest.org/Toronto for the full schedule and information about our speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction Knowledge. Sharmila, over to you.
Thank you, Suraj, and thank you to Namita Gokhale, Willie Dalrymple, and Sanjoy Roy for putting together the Jaipur Lit Fest this pandemic year. And good afternoon to you, Vickery in Toronto, and good evening to you, Richard, in the UK. And hello to everyone around the world joining us, whatever time it might be for you. We're going to dive right into the future of libraries, the present of libraries, but I thought we'd begin a little bit with a little bit of the past, and not just of libraries. I want to actually ask our two amazing librarians and leaders in this world to tell us a little bit about their earliest library experiences. And since this is the JLF Toronto edition, Vickery, may I start with you? And before you became the city librarian of this incredible cultural institution of the city of Toronto, I'm sure you began first as a library user. So could you tell us a little bit about your first forays into a library, perhaps as a young girl? And then we'll take it over to Richard, who could tell us about the Deal Public Library in the UK.
Well, not surprisingly, I started my experience with public libraries as a young child, as you say, and spending a lot of time in children's departments and with the assistance of the librarians there to find books that I was interested in. And it was really then that, my love of reading developed. And but it was at university, actually, that I really appreciated libraries. I went to the University of Toronto, and there are a number of libraries there that I used. I was a history major, so I was always doing research. And it was there that I really, I used libraries throughout my school career, but it was at university that I really began to understand the value and the importance and the essential role that libraries play, not just in helping people do research, but in the preservation of knowledge and the importance of documenting cultural heritage and maintaining that documentation and preserving it and curating it and organizing it so the content can be found. So that was really I did start my library career at a very young age attending libraries, but as I said, it wasn't until I reached university that I really appreciated the value and the role of libraries.
Richard, what about you? Tell us a little bit. You write about this in your book. Tell us about the Deal Public Library.
So I grew up in this very small town on the Kent coast, on the English Channel coast, a few miles along the coast from Dover. And, my parents were working class. We didn't have many books in our home. So, my mother took me to the children's branch of the Deal Public Library when I was a very small child. And it just became a kind of routine. It was a normal thing to do, to go to the library and pick up books and come back with them. And then when I was a teenager, I think that was the transformational thing about that public library for me, was the sense that there were new worlds, and that those new worlds were fiction, and they were almost literally new worlds, because what I encountered and what really got me deeply into reading was science fiction. And I can remember just walking around those shelves looking for the yellow dust wrappers of the gallant science fiction books, and I would just pounce on those. And eventually I ran out of them, and a librarian showed me that there were actually other publishers that published science fiction and how to find them. And so I just read through the shelves, and then gradually I encountered other types of knowledge in the library. Broadsheet newspapers, because my parents read a tabloid newspaper every day, and I had no idea that there were such things as serious broadsheet newspapers. And then vinyl records, and so I was able to understand that there was more to classical music than the single recording of Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture that we had in our house. Everything else was Frank Sinatra, basically. So, that it opened up new worlds for me, and I would not be here talking to you from my role in the University of Oxford and all that jazz if it wasn't for the Deal Public Library, a free public library service mandated by law in the United Kingdom.
And neither would I be here, I think, talking to the two of you if it wasn't for the public library systems of the town I grew up in here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tell us a little bit, perhaps we start with Richard this time, about the new laws, because I think for many of our viewers, I think we can say our viewers might be in two categories. Either they absolutely take for granted the idea that there are free public libraries where one can go, and as you said, Richard, a young child can discover new worlds, find newspapers and magazines that their parents don't subscribe to, or even music, and I mean, these days, of course, access to the internet. And there are, because we have a global audience for this session, we also shouldn't, I think, take for granted that these public libraries are easily available to all around the world. So for many, it's quite a precious thing, or maybe even a desired thing, that their city or their country doesn't have. Tell us a little bit about the history of the law, I think beginning in the 19th century.
Yeah.
In the UK, that made these public libraries possible, and but it doesn't quite get finalized until the 1960s in the UK.
Absolutely, I think sort of the first libraries in the UK going back to the Middle Ages were religious institutional libraries almost exclusively, and then at the Reformation they began to become secularized, and we have the secularization of the universities, and we have one or two other secular institutions that have libraries. With the beginning of town libraries, but these were, although they were secular, they were essentially kind of private institutions, and in fact the Bodleian is one of the few institutions that were open generally to the public, although the sense of the public 400 years ago is very different to what we would associate now. And it was really during the 18th century with the Enlightenment and the growth of the idea, the concept of things like useful knowledge, and the sense that democratizing knowledge, or at least making it more widely available, is both a social, but I think more importantly, an economic good. It will stimulate, self-advancement. It will stimulate entrepreneurial and economic activity. And gradually in the 19th century, that becomes much more kind of broadly accepted as a good thing. And in the 19th century, we have the first Public Libraries Act, which allows local authorities to levy additional local taxes in order to fund a public library service. And it's really at that point only an allowance, so it provides the opportunity under legislation for local authorities to do that. And many of them, of course, do. And at the same time as this kind of civic entitlement, there becomes the sense of local civic leaders investing it back into their community with, in particular with public libraries in order to expand education. And I think you see that most dramatically with Andrew Carnegie. At first in his native Scotland, in his native Dunfermline, and then across the United States and other parts of the British Empire. And that kind of sense of civic pride we still see in many of our cities today. The John Rylands Library in Manchester, for example, and that there are many other libraries which have subsequently been taken over either by universities or by local authorities that are kind of civic jewels. But it's only in 1964, actually, that it becomes a requirement on local authorities. They have to supply a free public library service. And it's really that act that I benefited from. 1964 was the year of my birth. And what we have seen since then is a kind of peak in the provision of that service in my country, and now we're in decline. So in the last 10 years, I write about this in my book, we've lost 800 branches of our public library service in the United Kingdom. It's absolutely staggering figure. And many of them continue to run, but they're run by volunteer groups, and it's a very diminished and impoverished service. And I think a democratic society, a pluralistic society like ours, is really suffering with that fact at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Tell us about maybe a little bit about the history of the Toronto Public Library, and also sort of public libraries in general in Canada. And are you seeing the same kind of closing of branches and so forth that Richard just touched on?
Well, libraries in Toronto and in Canada it started in the 19th century. as mechanics institutes and evolved into public library services. They received municipal funding to support them. And we also benefited from Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy. We have a number of Carnegie libraries still operating in Toronto as part of our 100-branch network. We're fortunate in Toronto and in Canada generally. We have not seen the diminished funding and support for public libraries that Britain has seen. In Toronto, we are well funded and we have predictable ongoing funding. There's always discussions each year, obviously, with our municipality, with the City of Toronto, but there is tremendous support for public library service. So we are very fortunate to be in that position here in Toronto. One thing I will say, and just kind of building on what Richard was saying, is that public libraries have been a democratizing force in the modern world, supporting literacy and a literate population, free and equitable access to a diversity of information and ideas, supporting lifelong learning and intellectual freedom, and preserving cultural history, preserving knowledge. And I think what is really so concerning, and Richard, this is really a theme throughout your book, is our challenges to our democratic values and freedoms. And it's really important for libraries to be able to stand up and continue in its historical role in preserving access to information and the preservation of knowledge. And so it's very disturbing when we see funding being cut for public libraries, but even more so. And Richard, the chapters in your book about the digital deluge and Paradise Lost, you talk about the challenges of the digital world in the 21st century and how difficult it is for libraries to be able to deal with the digital marketplace and the big players, the social media players, the Amazon. Amazon doesn't sell books to public libraries, it's ebooks. Audible, which is owned by Amazon, won't sell e-audiobooks to public libraries. And that really undermines our ability to provide access to information and equitable access to knowledge and what's available. It's not just Amazon, it's the multinational publishers have very restrictive terms and conditions for ebooks and e-audiobooks that make it very difficult for libraries to build those collections and to sustain those collections. So we've been advocating to address that issue, but it's as Richard says in his book, and I really feel that Richard's book is a call to action, that we really need to stand up, and we need legislative regulations and oversight of the big tech companies, of the publishers of digital content, because preserving that content is more complex, it's more challenging, and we need access to it. And in many ways, and many times, we don't have access to the content. And when we do, it's restricted or very expensive.
Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it's interesting, sort of building on what Vickery has just been saying, that in this period in the aftermath of the presidential election just south of the Toronto border, we are in this kind of extraordinary period with the kind of the denial of basic democratic truths, that the election was won, or that's being kind of denied and undermined at the moment. I think it's extraordinary that we're in an age where some of the funders of the Trump campaign have targeted anti-library legislation or anti-library funding in the states of the United States. And it seems that it's now increasingly recognized that libraries are forces for democratic and plural societies, and that they are under attack. And that attack is not just, not simply sort of, putting a match to the combustible material, but is about undermining their role, undermining their funding, and through the power of what my Oxford colleague Timothy Garton-Ash calls the private superpowers, these extraordinarily powerful and wealthy and increasingly assertive multi-international tech companies, that our role is being subverted and moved from the public realm. And I think that sort of passage of history that we were just talking about, both in Canada and in the United Kingdom, from the middle of the 19th century onwards, has been putting knowledge into the public domain. And that's what libraries have been really kind of passionately dedicated towards doing. And what we're seeing now is that those knowledge domains, commercial world, with increasing barriers to entry. And that is not only dangerous in terms of limiting access to knowledge, and that access is essential for, an educated public, a public who needs that education in order to be able to decide how to vote, apart from doing all sorts of other things. But it's also harvesting the knowledge that those platforms are able to create in this new digital world, and particularly the social media companies. And we're increasingly aware that that harvesting of our digital interactions is being targeted against us. And we're seeing that, that whole sort of surveillance capitalism that Shoshana Zuboff talks about. At first, we thought this is all just being targeted for commercial advertising, but increasingly we know it's targeted for political means, not just to encourage us to vote in a particular way, but more sinister, to identify people who should be suppressed from voting because they will influence an election in a way that the forces that are influencing this kind of behavior are against. And I think we've seen that not only in the UK's Brexit referendum in 2016, the 2016 presidential election in the United States. We've seen, incredible accounts of these great archives of information about us or about our friends in the United States, but also in other countries. And I think we're just on the cusp of ways in which these corporations are going to use that social knowledge for reasons that we just do not understand yet fully.
So we see a kind of a movement towards a greater kind of making knowledge more public and publicly available from the 19th to the 20th century, but in the late 20th century, kind of a reversal, a kind of a rise of privatization, be it through the rise of certain kinds of tech companies, social media, and so forth. I think the three of us, we began the session talking sort of, perhaps, in a way, I want to make sure that those listening today who were born in the 21st century don't see us as relics of a past. I mean, I have quite wonderful memories of going through the card catalog, which is how we used to find books in the library. And frankly, being able to roam a library unsupervised. I think the library allowed me the sort of a certain kind of promiscuous reading that really complemented what I was learning in American public schools. And that sort of, is something that, what if an 18-year-old or a 16-year-old or a 14-year-old says, but that's what I get when I surf the web. Why should I go to the library when I have Wikipedia or when I have a smartphone? I can, look, as you said, look that up. Richard, for those of you who don't know his book, he says, once upon a time, look it up meant, walk to the library. And as I said, in my case, often looking through that card catalog, walking to that exact place in the stacks and finding the book. But look it up means something else now. So to, our viewers who might be, Gen Z, or even people who are parents of that generation, what would the two of you, Vickery, Richard, say, what's the relevance of the library when we have this always near us?
Well, I guess I'd start off by saying that, you know, libraries have really benefited from the internet and technology and have embraced it. Because it's true. You used to have to walk into a library and go through a card catalog, and you didn't know what was in that library until you did that. Now you can go online and you can look at the catalog of the Bodleian libraries and see what's there. You can do that with Toronto Public Library. You have access to a tremendous wealth of information throughout the world. And that is one of the issues, of course, with our digital age, is there's tremendous wealth of information. And the public library is a place, or any library is a place where you can go to, and you have professional staff who will help you navigate and find the information that is available to you. And public libraries are tremendously trusted. Pew Research has done, and I think actually you quote that in your book, Richard, has done surveys of what a trusted institution public libraries are. It's a place to go to verify the facts. A huge, huge opportunity for people in today's world where there is so much misinformation and fake news. And that is what people are still doing. And in fact, libraries have produced guides to how to spot fake news and how to verify your resources, your sources of information. But in addition to that, libraries are cultural hubs. You know, in Toronto, we have 100 different branches. Well, we're not just one institution, we're 100 institutions reaching and serving people where they live. And I think that that's tremendously important. It's really kind of remarkable if you think about it, that the library is a public space where you can walk into, you can walk up to a computer and use it. You can go to a program free of charge, any kind of a program, and learn about, you know, different cultures, different experiences, people talking about different books. You can learn new technologies with digital innovation hubs. You can sit there and study and access and look at material on any topic you choose. And when you do that, you walk into a library that welcomes you without judgment. It doesn't matter what your background is or who you are or what your cultural background is. All that matters is that you are a member of the public who wants to walk into a library and use it to your own personal benefit. And with that, there is protection of your privacy. There is respect for the work and your various interests, and there are professional staff there to help you. And I can't think of a more democratic act than walking into a public library and be able just to choose to read whatever you want, to research whatever you want. And the technology is there to help you. And one thing I do want to touch on in saying this too is that I think that we have to recognize that there is a digital divide that is growing and has been amplified by this pandemic. And public libraries bridge that digital divide. I always say that in the 20th century, access to information and access to education, they were the great equalizers. And that's still true today. But in the 21st century, access to technology is just as important. If you do not have access to technology in today's world, you will not be successful. And that's what the public library does. It levels the playground. It gives people the opportunity, the access, the opportunity, and the connections to be successful in today's world. And that's why the public library is still so relevant today.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, I don't know if any of those of you watching know Eric Kleinenberg's book called Palaces for the People, where he's a sociology professor at NYU, and he talks very kind of powerfully as libraries as social infrastructure. And I think that's, in terms of public policy, I think that's a very important concept for our civic leaders to think of the public library as being, you know, as essential as the road network or, you know, the sewerage. You know, you don't notice that they're there sometimes until they go wrong, when that you really do notice. And I think the same is absolutely true of public libraries and libraries more generally. And I think one of the things I'd like to add on to Sharmila's question about, how libraries are relevant today, and that is a lot of what you find online is only there because a library had it in the first place, or a library digitized it, or a library partnered with a local community group, or a library partnered with a publisher. I mean, so many publishers come to us to say, well, we're digitizing our back files, and we discover we don't have one. And, they know that we kept it all these years. So I think there's been a bit of a problem that libraries tend to be quite sort of, not quite shy and retiring, but not sufficiently advocating for the essential nature of our role. Mm-hmm. And I think we should become better at doing that, and louder and more urgent in the way that we go about that communication. And I think the other piece that Vickery was mentioning about educating our user groups, I think even in the University of Oxford, which has a pretty highly educated readership, many of the young people coming as freshers into Oxford still don't actually understand that the first results you get when you put a term into Google have been placed there by advertising, that they're paid results, and just simple things like that. And so, to some extent, this kind of digital literacy needs to start happening at a younger age. Absolutely. But certainly we in the public library network across all age groups and in universities with our young people need to be redoubling our efforts to help our community, help our fellow citizens navigate this increasingly dangerous online world, an online world which is being, deliberately shaped in order to see the user as the product, as the, the raw material for their commercial endeavor.
I couldn't agree more with you, Richard. In fact, in terms of digital literacy, we do need to start teaching it at a much younger age. And we've actually started teaching algorithmic literacy for our patrons, because people don't understand how algorithms are filtering and segmenting people's online experiences. They have no understanding. They don't understand why when they do a search for, some new shoes, and then all of a sudden all sorts of shoe ads start being promoted and being sent to them as part of their online experience. Algorithms are hugely powerful and are need to be understood by people who are searching the internet, who are as part of their online experience, so that they can be more discerning with what's going on in terms of that experience.
I love what you said a little earlier, Vickery, about this reminding us of the space of the library and human beings in that space, because the library doesn't just house the books and the papers, but it's actually the people in it, the people running it, the people using it. And we might be online, and people often come, and you're right, those who don't have access to the internet from their own homes, come to the library, and we might be online, but we're also sort of, human bodies in a particular place together. And that vision for me of a young student, for whom, and there are thousands like that around the world, aren't there, who are lucky to have public libraries, where the library is often the only place you can do homework in a quiet way, because you might not have a kind of domestic situation that allows even an hour of quiet. We have a few minutes left before our audience starts asking questions. I want to take some very quick, I wanted to, kind of bring some people into this. Richard, you have lots of stories of sort of destruction of knowledge, just libraries burned and looted and smashed. But also people who did something to reverse that course of destruction. Those who preserved, those who put libraries together, and those who are doing so right now. So I would love for our viewers to kind of hear of some names or places around the world where librarians or archivists have actually worked or are working hard to push back against this destruction of knowledge?
Well, I'll take one example, which is from the Holocaust. Perhaps the most dramatic period for the destruction of knowledge in history. But in that period, there are so many acts of incredible, inspiring bravery in order to preserve the knowledge of Jewish communities in particular, in order to bear witness to what happened to them. And I think they were some of the most moving stories that I encountered doing the research for the book. And in particular, I talk about a group of Jews in Vilnius, in modern day Lithuania, what was at the time called Vilna, the capital city, a great center for Eastern European Judaism, great religious center, but also a kind of cultural center as well. And after the Nazis occupied the city in 1941, and a ghetto was formed into which the Jews were all moved, the great libraries and archives of the city were divided up. The contents were sorted almost in a kind of chilling prefigurement of the kind of human genocide that was to come. And those books were either sent off to paper mills to be pulped, or some of the rarer, more unique things were sent back to Germany. And the Jews that were forced to do this at gunpoint were called by the Nazi guards the Paper Brigade. And this kind of name caught on amongst themselves, and they started to call themselves the Paper Brigade. And they were librarians, they were archivists, but they were scholars. There was also a great poet. And what they did was actually to smuggle pages from the books and documents that they were sorting in their clothing back into the ghetto every night. And, at incredible risk, almost certainly they would have lost their lives if they'd have been discovered. And they brought these books and documents back into the ghetto. They hid them in the ghetto. And of course, in late 1943, the ghetto was liquidated, and the majority of the Jews were murdered. But some of them escaped and joined the partisans in the forest, and they came back into the city with the Soviet army, having pushed the Nazis out and recovered those great troves of documents. And I think that story of the kind of desire to preserve, at the risk of your own life, the kind of cultural and intellectual record of your community. And again, I found numerous other incredible examples of that. And today that spirit continues, and you see that with, librarians joining forces to rebuild the Library of Mosul in Iraq that was destroyed by ISIS. You see it in Yemen, where there's a great multinational support effort to digitize the manuscripts of the small but, unique and fragile Zaidi community. Of Muslims in with their own very ancient book culture. And you see it, across the globe. There are many other examples in Central America, in Guatemala, after a terrifying civil war. There was a period where the secret police archive became opened up as an ability to kind of have a kind of reconciliation, almost like in South Africa, a truth and reconciliation process. And that then gets with support from the US-backed regime, gets locked down again. And there's a great kind of political and legal battle to open that archive back up at the moment. And you see this also in the digital realm, where there are kind of activist archivists, preserving all of Donald Trump's deleted tweets, in a way that they're able to, because the Presidential Records Act doesn't actually give the National Archives of the United States enough power to be able to do that themselves at the moment. And, all over the world, there are these kind of great activist archivist happenings going on. I find it very inspiring.
I see some questions coming up. In fact, Richard, I think you answered a couple of the questions, which are about how can librarians and archivists, what can they do to protect knowledge from destruction? And I think you answered some of that by giving us some recent examples from the 20th century and also what's going on right now. Vickery, I see a question for you. Perhaps we don't have a lot of time and we have a lot of questions, so if you can keep it brief. A few words about Carnegie Mellon's, Andrew Carnegie's library in Toronto. There's a viewer who has an interest in the history of how Carnegie contributed to the Toronto library system.
Yes, well, our oldest branch is our Yorkville branch, and it is a Carnegie library, and it's one of, there were about 7 libraries that were, memory doesn't serve me all that well right now, but I think there were 7 Carnegie libraries in Toronto, and there are a number of them that are still operating. But that was, the oldest one is our Yorkville branch. It's a Carnegie library, and it was 1884, around that period of time that it was built. And it is it's in the classic Carnegie style with the big pillars and the stairway at the front. And it's very well used. It's in the heart of the downtown Toronto area. Yes, it was, that's our oldest branch.
I see a number of questions coming through about disinformation, fake news, trolling online. So I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions here. One is, what can libraries do to fight the spread of disinformation? I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but also how does one create knowledge? I guess, Richard, you're writing about the destruction of knowledge. We have a viewer who wants to say, how do you create knowledge in the era of fake news and disinformation and trolling, with, of course, statistics also show us that women, people of color, and other disenfranchised groups are more likely to get trolled online. So the playing field is certainly not even when you're sort of going out there. And what can libraries do? Perhaps you can also talk about what they're doing to preserve everything that's out there in social media, right?
Well,
Twitter.
Archiving social media is part of this whole effort to suppress disinformation, because it's only when we preserve the truth, but also the falsehood, that we can be able to study and understand the difference between the two. And I think that's part of the difficulty at the moment, is that the disinformation is so kind of fluid and it comes and goes all the time, that you need to be able to pin these things down. It's about kind of reference points for the truth. And sometimes this takes time, and we need to rebuild our trust in the institutions, rebuild our sense of values in, evidence and, responsible publishing. Independent publishers like your own great house need to be kind of treasured. The sense of a plural publishing universe needs to be supported. There's a great resurgence, I think, and we've seen that in the pandemic, of small publishing houses being supported by, Kickstarter programs, or, kind of communities coming together to see that kind of diversity of opinion appearing in kind of published form. I think we owe it ourselves as a society to, double down on things like responsible science, reproducibility. And I think libraries and archives have an essential role to play by preserving that knowledge, so that the public can go back and test it for themselves. And if it's wrong, they can call it to account and see that it's corrected. Or, and it goes to the same for the statements of our elected officials. They need to be brought into the public open for transparency.
So many questions coming. I see one that is fascinating. So maybe this can be the last thing we can wrap up with. We have 1 minute left. What is it? One of the viewers is asking you both, what is the shape, the physical shape of the library of the future? we were talking a little bit of the library as a space, right? How are interiors of libraries and library design changing? You two are in libraries all the time. Tell us.
Vickery, you go ahead.
Well, I'll start off. Well, it's flexible public space. I mean, we're in the midst of this pandemic where access to public space is restricted, but the human condition is such that people need to be able to interact with people, and having access to public space is really important. And there's public space is less and less available to people. People like to come to the library just to be alone together, and it needs to be flexible because of the changing way in which we deliver services and the different ways we deliver programs and the different technologies and how we have to change with those technologies. So, I mean, ultimately, this space has to be flexible and it has to be a seamless experience for our customers. The customer experience is so important, and in terms of the online experience, this omni-channel experience, and the in-person experience, it all has to be seamless for our customers, and it has to be easy for them to be able to access and use the library in whatever form they choose to use the library. So, in a word, I would say flexibility is really key to libraries moving forward.
And I'd just like to kind of add to that by saying I think the library in our community, it needs to be open and welcoming and easy to access and have a sense that the community owns the library. But I think it also should reflect the importance of knowledge and the importance of that being a kind of civic public institution. So I think there's that kind of, I don't see why libraries shouldn't be grand in buildings which the public should be proud of and proud of what they symbolize, but at the same time they shouldn't be off-putting or exclusive. So I think there's a kind of balancing act for the library of the future to play in that regard inside our communities.
Flexible, inclusive infrastructures that we can be proud of, but they needn't be so magnificent that we're actually afraid to go inside. I think we've come to the end of our session. Go to a library near you. This is Richard's book. You can find it in libraries. You can find it in bookshops. But since today is all about libraries, I recommend you get it through interlibrary loan, order it, get it online. If you're in a city where you're able to go with your mask on to a library, please go get it. And thank you so much, both of you, Vickery, Richard, for spending some time with us and telling us about the past, the present, and the future of the library.
Well, thank you, Sharmila, for your great chairing of our discussion, and thank you for Vickery for inviting us to Toronto and to the JLF for making this happen.
Yes, it's wonderful. And thank you to both of you. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you, Richard and Vickery, for that really wonderful session. And thank you, Sharmila, for being a fabulous moderator. Absolutely. As you all mentioned, it's extremely radical to understand the importance of the libraries and how crucial it is for us to come together and push back on this whole agenda of destructing the knowledge, and especially in times like now. So thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you at JLF Toronto Virtual Festival. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers available through bookstores listed on the JLF Toronto website. As we almost come to the close of our JLF Toronto and eventually the 2020 virtual editions of JLF North America today, it's my pleasure to invite the festival producer and managing director, Team Bokats, Sanjoy Roy, to share his closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Suraj, and thank you, Richard, Sharmila, Vicky. That was such a brilliant session. 4 weeks ago, when we began JLF North America, we began at the Boulder Public Library, which is our partner in Boulder, Colorado, to end it today with this wonderful session on library and how important knowledge is. As we all know, in this great time of hatred and of misinformation, what we really need is access to to the right kind of information, to facts, to be able to check up on them. And what better places than to do that than in libraries, which, as you both said, are democratic places of great access. We need to be concerned about issues around bandwidth. We are creating a new generation of people who have no access to bandwidth. So when you're talking about equity and democracy and the right to knowledge and information, we need to be very, very conscious of how this is the new divide. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Washington or in Delhi or Djibouti or any other part of the world, bandwidth is a problem. So as we move into the future, we need more flexible spaces to be able to learn, to be able to discover, to be inspired, to be able to innovate and to create. Thank you all for being part of the JLF story. This also marks the end of JLF 2020. We have moved digital. We've had JLF in London, JLF in Adelaide. We've had JLF across North America. And we hope to be back in 2021, however difficult it may be, with some version of the Jaipur Literature Festival, because collectively we need platforms to be able to push back on the narrative that we see today of hatred and disinformation. So thank you all. Thank you to all our many partners. And on behalf of my colleagues, Shrinka Walia and her colleagues at JLF Toronto, Suraj, Kritika, and all our colleagues at Teamwork Arts, a big thank you. Stay safe, stay masked, and look forward to seeing you again, inshallah, not so far away. Have a wonderful Christmas and a wonderful New Year. Suraj, back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sanjoy, and thank you all once again. It's never easy to put up a festival together, may it be on ground or may it be virtual. There's so much of blood and sweat goes into it to make it a success. Many individuals, organizations, and partners come together to make it a win. And so was the case for JLF Toronto, JLF Houston, JLF New York, and JLF Colorado. So on behalf of Teamwork Arts, I would like to thank our festival co-directors for the fantastic curation, all our speakers for joining in from different parts of the world, despite being in different time zones, all our partners, friends of the festival, all our advisors, volunteers, and of course, all my dear, dear, dear colleagues who have been working day and night to make this a success. A big shout out to JLF Toronto team and all our partners. And of course, to our dearest friend, colleague, partner in crime, Executive Director, JLF Toronto, Shrinka Walia. And above all, you ladies and gentlemen, you are the reason we curate and create festivals for. Without you, we are nothing. So thank you so much for supporting JLF, for supporting arts, and for supporting literature. On that note, we would like to bid goodbye with a promise that we will be back with a bang. Meanwhile, please join us for a reading by Tabia Azdasi from the Jaipur Writer Short series, followed by our last session, Kahani Online, Shadow Puppetry by Drew Colby. Thank you so much and see you soon.
Hello, my name is Tabia Azdasi and I am a student at the University of Toronto in my second year. This is my poem, No News. I ran the crowd out of my apartment by barking at the moon, an animal and not much more. How we grew old, so indelicately, spinach stuck in the gaps between our teeth, corroded by cigarette breaks, we were not yet tired enough to have to take so often. On the putrid blue squares of train seats, crashing couches until they sink to the floor, I have been here and here and here, and your mother yells across a room, an ocean of carpets, she won't take any more. I dreamt a poem that ran through a block in kitten heels and has since sold itself ragged for 20 years, is missing a tooth, and between her legs through the jungle of glass is still somehow wanted. 20 years later, her child and her unrequited love, and mother becomes a slip of the tongue when you're old enough, losing its grip on the consequences of meaning. It is strange that we were once children at all. Floating, sometimes we spark like filament. We are friends who drift apart, with kids and dogs and homes and jobs and shame for a friend who has not grown up. We are friends that drift apart, with prescription glasses that we may actually need, and oak desks to bend over, picked by our wives and mistresses that come to be less than kind. We are friends that drift apart, in the dizzy yellow lines of supermall mezzanines, in rush hour, unfriendly department stores, fists clenching and unclenching phantom pains. And in a year's time, I can only hope to remember your name, hang to its edges from back when I asked you what color you would be, and you said Egyptian blue. I wish I'd asked you what you meant. My mouth is oozing shame. We are friends that drift apart in New York City, the worst city for friends to drift apart. Where will I ever see you again?
Teamwork Arts, bringing India to the world and the world to India through Indian art and culture for over 30 years. One of Teamwork Arts' signature events, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts over 500,000 visitors a year. The Jaipur Bookmark, an international B2B event for the publishing industry, happens during the Z Jaipur Literature Festival and sees a confluence of publishers, writers, and literary agents. Teamwork Arts, producers of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, have taken the flavor of the festival to international shores with vibrant events in the UK, Australia, and the US. Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world with almost 12 festivals of India across continents in a stunning array in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature and so much more. In each of these places, Teamwork Arts' colourful festivals of India are the high points of the annual cultural calendars, be it Confluence in Australia, India by the Bay in Hong Kong, India by the Nile in Egypt, Ion India in Chicago, Shared History in South Africa, India in the Sunshine City in Zimbabwe, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Kala Utsavam in Singapore, Sarang in South Korea, festivals in Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, Sweden. The list is dizzying. The Jazz India Circuit is an endeavour by Teamwork Arts to spread the word and sound of jazz across the country. The 2017-18 season, 4 festivals across 3 cities featuring over 25 stellar artists from India and around the world, including Jojo Mayer and Nerve, drummer-singer Jameson Ross and Dave Weckl, who collaborated with the talented Mohini Day. The Mahindra Kabira Festival celebrates the spirit, lyric and verse of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir in his birthplace, the historic city of Varanasi. Kabir's poetry is about inclusiveness. Mahindra Kabira brings to music lovers an unforgettable experience of listening to leading exponents of the classical Banaras Gharana and rich folk traditions of music on the legendary banks of the mighty river Ganges, along with sessions on art and literature, specially curated walks with famous local residents and delectable local cuisine.